Hey guys, this is Mr. Bennett. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but we're going to start our notes anyhow for Unit 5. You'll do fine. I'm here with you in spirit, and we're going to learn about the groups and periods of the periodic table, as well as how to calculate the number of valence electrons. The first thing we're going to learn about is how to identify the groups and periods of the periodic table. So here we have a picture of our periodic table, the periodic table that we use in class. And it turns out that the groups and periods are things that we've talked about already, but we've never really given it the name of a group or period. So for example, our groups, we're going to look at our groups as being the columns of the periodic table. So here we would call this group 1. And if you actually sneak in there real close and look at your periodic table, what you'll see is that above this column of the periodic table, it's actually labeled group 1, so there's a 1 on top, and then below that there's a 1A. We'll talk more about that 1A in the future. Essentially anything with an A after it is called a representative element. But for our purposes, we would call this the group 1 elements. And then that means that the next column on the periodic table, this is group 2. Okay, now here's where it gets a little tricky though. Okay, so if you look down here, this is group 3, and so it continues through that middle section of the periodic table, group 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then we get all the way across to the P block, and we're up to group 13. Okay, so that's group 13. Okay. The tricky part. Don't get confused by those A's. In other words, this is group 13, but it's also known as 3A. We'll talk about how that 3A can be useful to us later, but keep in mind that it's the number on top that actually tells you the group number. So that's groups of the periodic table. And what you'll see is if you go all the way across, the final column is group 18. So there are 18 groups on the periodic table. Okay, so that's groups. Now for periods. Well, so far we've been looking at columns, right? Groups are the columns. Okay, now let's look at periods. So if you're jumping ahead right now and you've already figured it out, periods are the rows of the periodic table. And up until now, we've often referred to them as the energy levels, although we knew it wasn't entirely true because when we get to that D block, remember, those rows are technically a row below where they're supposed to be. But anyhow, back to periods. So periods are the rows of the periodic table. So if we look at this, for instance, this top section where we find helium and hydrogen is period 1. Okay, I'm going to put PER for period 1. Here is period 2. Here is period 3. And in fact, it's already labeled for you. Period 4, period 5, period 6, period 7. So the periods are simply just the rows of the periodic table, right? And as we go down the periods, we're getting atoms with more and more energy levels. Okay, so those are groups and periods of the periodic table. That's our first topic for this video. The next topic is going to be how to calculate the valence electrons, and we're actually going to shift into a video that I made last year. So when this background changes and things look a little different, that's because we're looking at a video clip from last year that I made that explains the valence electrons. So here we go.